In this video, we're going to use trigonometry to solve for missing side lengths of a right triangle. Now, in our previous video, we discussed how to label the sides of our right triangle based on something called theta. Theta represents our angle measure. And these were the trig ratios that we used: sine, cosine, and tangent. Where the opposite, if A was our theta, the opposite is across from that angle measure. In this example, B would be our adjacent, because it's next to that angle measure, and C here is our hypotenuse because it's across from the right angle. So our first step in trying to solve for a missing side length is always to label our triangle. I do apologize, this should have a right angle there. So our opposite from our theta is the side length across. Hypotenuse is always going to be across from the right angle, and the adjacent will always be next to theta. So looking at this, I need to find out what this missing length is, and I know the hypotenuse. So I want to use a trig ratio that uses the opposite and hypotenuse. And as you can see here, here's our trig ratios, opposite and hypotenuse length. That would be our sine ratio. So we can write an equation. Sine theta equals the opposite over the hypotenuse. So if I were to substitute, I would write this as the sine of 30 degrees equals x over 8. So now this becomes an algebra problem where I can see that if I want to isolate the variable x, I need to do the inverse operation, or I need to multiply by 8 instead of divide by 8. And what you're left with is that the side length equals 8 sine 30. Now this is where you're going to need to use a calculator, right? So I have a few calculators here that I want to show you that will help you with this calculation. The first one is a TI-34 calculator. You may have something similar. Usually with these models, you have the trig functions right here, sine, cosine, and tangent, but on mine it does not have that. Right? So we're going to have to look for what's called trig. I'm going to hit 8. I'm going to hit second trig in the yellow there, and it comes up with sine. If I want to find cosine and tangent, I have to scroll over. I'm going to hit enter and just type in 30. My solution is a length of 4. So x equals 4. Right, so this is 4 right here. It makes sense because if you remember from special right triangles, this is actually a 30, 60, 90 triangle. The hypotenuse is 2 times the smaller leg, so my answer is 4. Let's take a look at using the iPhone. When you have your iPhone and you turn it sideways, you can actually see all these different calculations here on the left. And if I plug this into the iPhone, it's a little different. I can't go in order from left to right as easy as the other calculator. So I'm going to show you two different ways. I can take my 30 and I'm going to hit the sine key and then multiply that by 8 and I get my solution of 4. So type in the angle measure, sine times 8 is going to equal 4. Another way of doing it is to actually go in order, but there's a few steps you have to be careful about. I'm going to type 8. I'm going to multiply it by not hitting the sine key, but I'm going to do 30. Don't hit the equal sign, because that'll be 240. That's not our solution. I'm going to hit the sine key now to be sine of 30, so it really just took the sine of 30. Then I'm going to hit the equals to equal 4. Practice this a little bit so you get used to using the calculator. Let's take a look at a couple examples. Solve for the missing side length. First step is always to label. So this is going to be my opposite. This is my adjacent side. And this is my hypotenuse. Which trig ratio will we use? Well, if I'm trying to find my opposite and I know the hypotenuse, I'm not going to use anything with the adjacent. So I'm just going to put an X here so you don't look at that. Opposite and hypotenuse, that's going to be our sine function. So I'm going to write this as the sine of 54 equals W over 17. We're going to multiply by 17 on both sides. So W equals 17 sine of 54. I'm going to use the iPhone calculator so you can see that example again. I'm going to hit 54, hit the sine key, then multiply by 17. Our solution is about 13.8. W is about 13.8 because we're rounding up. Another way to do it on your iPhone calculator would be 17 times 54, hit the sine key, then hit equals, and it comes out to your solution. The nice thing about the TI-34s is you can do it in order, but if you have an iPhone calculator, you have to do it a little out of order. Let's try another example. First, I'm going to label. This is my opposite. This is my adjacent. This is my hypotenuse. So you can see here that we don't have the opposite. We have the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So which trig ratio would I use? Looks like I'm going to use cosine. The cosine of 33 equals the adjacent W over 4.5. I'm going to multiply by 4.5 on both sides. And what you're left with is W is equal to 4.5 cosine 33. So using my calculator, again, I'm going to show both methods. We can do 33, hit the cosine key, and then multiply by 4.5. So my solution is about 3.8. Or I can try to go a little in order. We could do 4.5 times 33 cosine, then hit equals, and it comes out to the same solution. One more example, and this one's a little more challenging. I'm going to write this out, again, labeling. Here's our opposite, here's our adjacent, here's our hypotenuse. You can see I'm not going to use the hypotenuse. There's nothing written there for finding the missing side length. So which trig ratio would you use? Well, which trig ratio is opposite and adjacent? That looks like tangent. The tangent of 28 equals 1 over W, the adjacent. This is a little different than the previous example because now the missing length is in the denominator, so we have to do a couple different things. Now, there's two different ways I've seen this done. You could use, or a couple, more than two, but I've commonly seen it using cross products, or we can take the reciprocal of our fraction. What I mean by reciprocal is flipping this fraction, so that way W is actually in the numerator. This would be over 1. But when you do that to the right side of our equation, you must do it to the left. This is over 1. So I'm going to write this as 1 over tangent 28. It's a little different. In our calculator, if if I were to do this, let's do this with the TI-34 first. I could do 1 divided by, scroll over, the tangent of 28, and my solution is about 1.8. It's one way of doing it. With the iPhone, it is a little more challenging. What I'm going to do first, I'm going to say 1 divided by, I'm going to take my angle measure 28, hit the tangent key, so that's just the tangent of 28, and then hit equals, so that way it's 1 divided by that value. Oh, I'm sorry, it should be about 1.9. This does take an extra step, but that's okay. Just make sure you plug it into your calculator on your iPhone very carefully.